to invite my debate guests onto the stage. This is Bryan Caplan and Daniel DiMartino. All right. Gentlemen.
Good to see you.
Bryan, did you appreciate the hairdo we did for your wrestling counterpart?
I'm not actually that gray, am I?
Okay.
Not in my mind.
So before we get started, I'd like to put up a slide that will have a QR code where we can take your temperature on the issue. And as they prepare that slide, I'm going to read the proposition. The proposition we will be talking about today is, should the United States limit immigration based on merit? So if you can get a shot of that, I'm going to take 60 seconds, 90 seconds. Place your vote. Go back to the slide. Keep the slide with the QR code up, please. There we go. What do you think? Yes or no? Should the U.S. limit immigration based on merit? While you're doing that, I will introduce these two fine gentlemen. First, on the side of yes, to my left, Daniel DiMartino. He is a graduate fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the founder of the Dissident Project, an immigrant himself, and a Ph.D. candidate in economics at Columbia University, which is maybe rivaling Venezuela for freedom scale, so we're told.
Venezuelans are more freedom-loving than the average Columbia student.
Yes, I've noticed that. And on the no side is my longtime friend, Bryan Caplan, rapping extraordinaire, professor of economics at George Mason University, and New York Times best-selling author of the graphic novel Open Borders. All right. Let's start off first with an opening salvo from Daniel.
Yeah.
I will be keeping track of the score.
Sure. Well, thank you all for being here and for the time. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, John. I'd like to begin by telling you a little bit of a story, and that is that actually 69 years ago yesterday, my grandfather, my mom's father, immigrated, or really emigrated out of his native country, which was Spain, to Venezuela. Back then, Venezuela was the fourth richest country in the world. Spain was destroyed after the Civil War, the Francoist regime. He met his wife, too, who was from the same region of Spain in Venezuela, and they built a great life. And over the course of the next several decades, Venezuela was destroyed under the weight of a socialist regime, and even stagnation under its democratic period. And then my whole family left. I came to America in 2016. And that's really what's driven me, right? And it's that love for freedom, and it's that story that really destroyed the lives of millions of people, right? The largest refugee crisis in the world today is that of Venezuela. So then you would ask, Daniel, then why do you think we shouldn't just have open borders, right? And I think that we shouldn't, specifically because I care about ideas. If you believe that America is an idea and not an ethnic nation, right? Then you should care about the ideas of people. Because people are not goods. One thing is free trade of goods and services, right? Apples don't vote. Apples don't collect welfare checks. Apples don't commit crimes. People do, right? And when you buy and sell an apple, it's consensual. You're not really affecting a third party. But when a person comes into a new society or a new community, they do affect the neighbors in many ways. And most of this surplus of immigration goes to the immigrant, right, who improves their life. That's a great thing. I certainly improve my life, and most people do. But open borders are not a workable solution, and we saw just a glimpse of that over the last 4 years. My own research shows that even though the average immigrant pays more in taxes over their lifetime than receives in government benefits, and not like the average native, which, by the way, the average native in the United States is like a $250,000 net liability to the federal government, so that you guys know. The average immigrant is like a 10,000 positive, 10,000, nearly zero, right, in large terms. But a huge portion of immigrants are not net positives. In fact, nobody who didn't go to college in the United States, who's foreign-born, on average, will pay more in taxes than receiving benefits. Meaning, all these non-college educated immigrants, all these elderly immigrants, will come to America, pay taxes, that's true, but collect much more in government benefits. And I'll give you one excellent example of legal immigrants who are a huge burden on the United States, and that is that every American is allowed to sponsor their parents who are abroad. And in fact, 150,000 people or so, 15% of the legal immigrant flow, is parents of US citizens. All of those people are at least in their mid-50s. Most of them are in the early 60s, which means that they get to the United States, they work for 10 years, a low-paid job. Most of them don't even speak English. Maybe they'll be taxi cab drivers, maybe they'll work from home, they'll do something else. And then they'll collect Social Security and Medicare until they pass away. That is not sustainable. Why is the United States bringing in 150,000 people every single year who will collect more government benefits than paying taxes, when you could be bringing in 150,000 people who are young, highly educated? In fact, there's a huge backlog of highly skilled immigrants today who are Nobel Prize winner from India. You're not allowed to immigrate to the United States. So I am not against immigration. I am for immigrants to the benefit of the United States. We should have much more high-skilled immigration. We should have much more young immigration. But there is a limit. You cannot allow everybody to come in. And then you say, well, Daniel, but that's not what merit means. Merit is a much more subjective thing. To me, this is just a debate about whether we should have some limits to immigration in the national interest of the nation that's receiving those immigrants. And I think the answer is an unequivocal yes, right? We have to obviously limit criminals. When people will tell you, well, but immigrants and even illegal immigrants commit less crime than natives, I will tell you that's true because they're deported after they commit the first crime. Most crime in the United States is committed by people who commit a second, a third, and a fourth crime. Immigrants don't get a second chance. Immigrants are deported. That's why the statistic is low, is because you deport criminals. If you didn't deport them, believe me, the immigrant crime rate would be much higher than the native. There's a lot of people who entered the southern border over the last 4 years who were obviously going to be a net drag on society. And I think of a story of a lady from Venezuela who you only had to see her to know that she shouldn't be near you. Her nickname was Barbie. She was a child sex trafficker with tattoos on her face. This person did not sneak into the United States. This person was actually received by Border Patrol. She was vetted, and then she was released into the country. Welcome to the United States. That's what happens when you don't limit immigration. And like, oh, that's not a fair argument, Daniel. Nobody wants these people. Okay, let's exclude the criminals. What about the people who are self-professed communists? I didn't come to the United States so that the United States would become a communist country. And I don't think you want your children to grow up in a communist country. Now, you might say, Daniel, but there's plenty of native-born communists, and I'll tell you, I agree. Believe me, I've met plenty of those.
30 seconds, Daniel.
Should you be adding more people like that to the United States? You know, in the late 18th century, George Washington, the first president, founding father, who was one of the most pro-immigration of the founding fathers. There was an intense debate about immigration among the founding fathers. He wrote to a Dutch pastor welcoming him to the United States, and told him, I had always hoped that this land might become a safe and agreeable asylum to all the virtuous and persecuted part of mankind, to whichever nation they might belong. But he said to the virtuous and persecuted. He didn't say to all of mankind. Thank you.
All right, Bryan, you have 7 minutes.
All right. We're all thrilled that Ross Ulbricht, the man who created a tax-free platform for selling illegal narcotics, weapons, and much more, now freely walks the streets of America, right? Yes, all right. But what should libertarians think about people born in other countries who illegally come here to grow food, or wash dishes, or clean hotel rooms, or care for kids? Shouldn't we support massive government efforts to prevent them from coming here and deport the ones that are already here? To answer my own rhetorical question, obviously not. If libertarians will not stand up for the rights of foreigners that our government treats like criminals for doing hard jobs without getting government permission that is, by the way, almost impossible for them to obtain, then we stand for nothing and we are nothing. I'm really happy to have Daniel DiMartino, a young Venezuelan getting a Ph.D. in Columbia University here in the country with me. And I'd also be happy to welcome the rest of Venezuela, even though none of them are very likely to match his educational attainment or his tax contributions. By the way, warning, so if you do go to some of the sessions here at LibertyCon, you might wind up going to one on educational alternatives or possibly on tax avoidance, and then you too may not be finishing college or paying a lot of taxes either, so watch out. Now, of course, most people are not libertarians, and as you notice, it's very hard to change their minds. And therefore, it is always important to respond to arguments against liberty, even if you think that they are fundamentally mistaken. All right, so while most non-libertarians are very skeptical about immigration in general, they're generally especially skeptical about low-skilled / low-education immigration. Right, there's a lot of arguments, but the main one in this case is that these immigrants are especially likely to pay very little in taxes, still use a lot of government services, and therefore to be on net a fiscal burden on taxpayers. Milton Friedman, as you may recall, was so convinced by this argument that he publicly declared, you cannot have a welfare state and free migration, which is totally mathematically premature. Like a number of other scholars, Daniel DiMartino has gone far beyond Milton's mere fear-mongering by carefully crunching the numbers. So if you do have opinions on this issue, but you have never actually looked at any tax or spending information, be more like Daniel. Daniel is doing the right thing. Now, here is a quick summary of the implications of Daniel's assumptions. 1, immigrants have better fiscal effects than otherwise identical natives. Daniel's model actually concludes that immigrants are better than us if we are matched for other traits. Secondly, regardless of your nativity, we should expect you to be a net burden on taxpayers unless you finish college. All right, now, as far as arguments against immigration go, I think this is one of the best ones, but it's still not very good. All right, easiest reply to this model. Even low-skilled immigrants contribute something to society besides taxes. What could that be? Oh yeah, goods and services. Right? And we should definitely count that contribution for both natives and foreigners before we start calling someone a net burden on society. It is not just rude to call janitors parasites. It's false. They do contribute. Now, the next easiest reply. So what were all of Daniel's assumptions anyway? He didn't have time to go through the paper, and I understand that. So I don't have time to go through the assumptions either. But Daniel again did the right thing and he generously shared the model with critics. So we already know that it is not very hard at all to tweak Daniel's assumptions and put immigrants in a much more favorable light. And the tweaks, I will say, are in fact quite reasonable. All right. Now, all this aside, using the welfare state to argue against immigration is an extreme case of using a sword to kill a mosquito. Even the most incompetent government in the world can instantly switch an immigrant's fiscal status from negative to positive by excluding him from government benefits. In slogan form, build a wall around the welfare state, not the country. There is nothing unrealistic about this proposal. We already heavily restrict benefits for non-citizens, and we already restrict naturalization. There's no reason we couldn't increase the restrictions enough to ensure positive fiscal contributions for all migrants. And in fact, if the critics of immigration had spent the last 40 years single-mindedly crusading to restrict eligibility for the welfare state, they would probably have won long ago. Is it un-American to restrict benefits? I think it's un-American to treat farmers, dishwashers, hotel maids, and nannies like criminals because the government refuses to license to work for willing employers, rent from willing landlords, and shop from willing merchants. Finally, The idea that the people of the United States collectively own this country and have a right to decide who lives here has a name, and that name is, drum roll, socialism. Don't forget it. Thank you.
Bryan, you moved swiftly, so I'll let you open up the further counteroffensive, having now heard Daniel's arguments. What do you think he needs to answer for?
All right. Well, let's see. If we're going to say that people can't come to the country because they're a net negative because of their net negative fiscal effect, why not restrict which natives are allowed to have kids and how many kids they're allowed to have? Because we can do a model just like yours and figure out what the expected fiscal contribution of a newborn American baby is.
Very simple.
Yes.
Because it's immoral. And
Oh, that's immoral.
yeah, let me respond. Like, it's for the same reason, like, obviously, the homeless people are bad for the federal budget. That doesn't mean that I want to round up the homeless and deport them. I think it would be immoral.
Why not? They're a burden?
And the same reason, by the way, a lot of pro-choice people support abortion based on, like, consequentialist arguments, and I'm very pro-life regardless of how that baby is going to live or whatever. So I just don't think it's a strong argument because you're assuming that everybody has the right to be here and therefore it's immoral to prevent them.
Or we could flip it around and say, why assume that everyone born in this country has a right to be here?
Well, I guess some people actually do want to change that.
Yeah.
But, I do support, for practical reasons, birthright citizenship, at least for the US, and we can talk about that. But, I mean, I think you're making a moral argument. I'm making a more practical argument, which is that the reality is that a huge portion of the world, wouldn't you agree, would be better off being beggars in the United States than as how they live in their home country, right? Would you think that the United States would be better off if 1 million beggars suddenly flooded the streets?
I don't think they would be better off with 1 million beggars. I don't think that they are likely to come and be beggars if they've got an option to do something other than beg. So we've already talked about this over email,
Wait a minute.
why not share it with the audience? So here's my position. The countries in the world with the least bad immigration policies are the Gulf monarchies. Why? Because they let in an enormous number of people, including people who are very low skilled. Do those low skilled people burden the societies that they are coming to? No, because those societies do not give them much in the way of welfare benefits. That is a much better system. It is a system that respects their rights to actually go and improve their lives. It respects the rights of employers to hire them, respects the rights of landlords to rent to them. That is the better system, right? To go and say we've got to go and give people benefits because they're born here, or to say that we're going to keep people out because we are required to give them benefits if we do let them in, but it's okay to not let them in. Just a very obtuse position. Popular, but obtuse.
Daniel, any other things you'd like to respond to Bryan's argument with?
Like, do I get my time now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, how much do I have again?
Go on,
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, I think that that's a very telling position what Bryan has articulated, and I think it's a totally fair position. It's the one that indeed the Gulf countries have, and I don't think any of us would want to live in a country like those. But you reveal preferences, Bryan. Like, you are literally allowed to live there.
Because I've got a better option. Most people on Earth don't.
Well, I would contest it, and I actually say that it's actually partly culture. I don't think you would want to live in a culture that is 90% foreign-born, majority Muslim. I don't think you would enjoy that, and that's why you don't go. Yeah, and that's why I don't go either.
Yeah. Honestly, I've been there. The only problem is the heat. They do have bad weather.
Sure. I don't think that's the case for the majority of people. I think any reasonable person would say if the United States had a 90% foreign-born share, 90%, which to do that, by the way, you will need to increase the population of America by 3 billion people, which is not going to happen even if you had open borders, just because of mechanically the size. But that would be hellish, I think. I think it would end the United States as we know it, and it's not sustainable. And I'm not saying that we should have like less immigration or no immigration. I feel like I'm a very reasonable person. I think we should, in fact, we're below probably the sustainable number of legal immigrants, especially if they're highly skilled. But it's just totally different to have 1 million people a year who are high school dropouts who don't speak English or who are old and are, say, Islamic, versus 1 million people who do speak English, are broadly Western, and are college educated. It's like a totally different thing. You could have probably 10 million of those and very few of the others.
Yeah, so if you have not been to Emirates, I highly encourage you to do it.
It's on my bucket list.
Here is the amazing thing. You start off with a population that is not only Muslim, but actually quite backwards for the Muslim world in 1971. And what has happened? Have the immigrants become like the people there? No. Have the natives become like the immigrants? No. What's happened is both groups have become highly westernized. It is easier to get by.
Let me counter, since it's my time, by the way. I would say, very simply, the UAE has become a much more liberalized country, and I think that's a good thing, because they started from, as you say, a very bad position. And it is because of immigration. Indeed, they're one of the first ones to legalize alcohol consumption, where women are maybe allowed to not wear a hijab, and those are good things. Now the question is, would it be a good thing if the United States became less free, less Western? I'm not saying that we should stop all immigration, that we should have racially discriminatory immigration, that we should have even religiously discriminatory immigration. But I do think that values matter. And if you are, say, somebody who supports Hamas, as we see on college campuses recently, and you say openly that you do, why should you be allowed to enter the United States? What if you say that you support the Cuban regime in Cuba right now? And in fact, let's say that you even worked for them. You're coming here to work, you're not going to commit any crime. Would you allow that person into the United States?
Actually, I would. And well, most obviously,
I would not.
Guess what? A lot of people in
unless it's to put them in prison.
Right, here.
A lot of people in communist countries work for the government, even though they don't like it, because they are stuck in a freaking
I'm saying that they
country.
supported it.
Yes.
Would you allow
you
somebody
no.
who supported
Yes.
the regime?
Somebody who supported it, I would still let them in. You know why? Because there's not very many of them, and I'm not worried they're going to win.
Well, I think one is one too many.
Yes. Well, so you are an economics student, so I'm going to chastise you for that. There's only one way to eliminate the risk, and that is to not let anyone in. It is the standard issue of if you are so cautious that you are hyper worried about allowing one problem.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying you should ask.
That is basic risk analysis, Daniel. If you say we can't allow one case of COVID, then you have to lock your country down.
No, I mean, I think this is very simple. I think you should just ask people. In fact, it's already under the law. One of the first immigration restrictions in U.S. history was ideological, by the way. It was to ban anarchists, then it was to ban communists, then it was to ban polygamists, prostitutes, and pimps, also to ban beggars. I think all those restrictions were very common sense restrictions.
Any anarchists here who would have been banned?
Well, it was, I think, a different...
The wrong kind of anarchist.
No government is...
We can trust government to figure out who are the good anarchists and who are the bad anarchists.
Well, I will say, I do think it's okay to ban, for example, Nazi party members, as they were banned after World War II. Maybe you are not. I think I'm totally fine with that.
What I'll say is, to keep out all the Nazis, you'd have to keep out a whole bunch of innocent people too. Better to just let them in and accept this tiny risk of a few bad people coming.
All right, let me jump in now for a minute. So, Bryan, you've got one proposition that I'm curious to hear you elaborate on, which is, let's build a wall around the welfare state. How is that not fundamentally a utopian argument? Because the politics of shrinking the welfare state in the United States has so far proven to be fundamentally very, very difficult and getting harder.
That's a great question. Of course, the word utopian comes from the root of nowhere. How do we know if an argument is utopian? Well, let's see whether there are 0 places on Earth that actually fit the argument. As it turns out, we already restrict welfare benefits right here, right now in the United States. We don't even have to go to a better country like Emirates. Joke. But better immigration policy, definitely. So we already see the United States has a lot of restrictions on eligibility for welfare benefits. These were increased in the 1996 Act. We also, of course, restrict naturalization. Once you see that you're restricting these benefits, it is obviously not utopian to say, let's move the dials further and keep moving them until we get them to a better place. I'd say the real story is that most people who complain about immigrants abusing the welfare state do not actually care about fiscal sustainability or anything else except for keeping out immigrants, and they're looking for an excuse. I'm not saying that's Daniel. But if they had taken that energy against immigration and targeted it narrowly on raising the number of years for naturalization up from 5 or 7 up to 30, they would have already done it. And we wouldn't have to be having this conversation anymore. So that is what any sincere person who's worried about this problem should be doing. Although obviously, if we read Daniel's paper, and we all should read Daniel's paper, the main lesson of the paper is that we are on a path of fiscal ruin because the vast majority of the entire population, native and foreign, is not covering its way. So that is the much more fundamental thing to be working about. Rather than scapegoating immigrants, we should be talking about deep cuts in the welfare state. Any way, any method, whatever we can do needs to happen, and ASAP.
Daniel, what about the challenge that Bryan sort of quipped about, which is, why would you trust that the government could make rules for merit that would not be nonsense?
Absolutely. I think that's, in fact, the best challenge to my position. But I would say that, we trust the government to enforce a lot of rules, even though we think that they're not optimal. Because the government does have a role in society. I mean, maybe some of you are actually anarcho-capitalists and you don't want that. But like when you just give the police power to the government, you're trusting them to do things, and they will also make mistakes. Sometimes somebody will be wrongfully arrested. Somebody will be wrongfully convicted. Somebody will be wrongfully killed by law enforcement. Does that mean that we need to abolish the police? The left thinks so. I don't. I think we need to reform it and make it better. And I think the same thing on immigration. I think that the current immigration system is too bureaucratic. It's terribly targeted, allows a lot of people who are bad, allows too few people who are good, and it needs to be reformed and made easier bureaucratically, cheaper. It could even allow people to pay enough money to be in, maybe be more like Canada or Australia based on your characteristics. And you say, well, Daniel, this is central planning, right? This is government central planning of immigration. I don't hope to convince you that you support government central planning of immigration. I wouldn't even call it that. But I do hope to convince you that you do support some restrictions and that this is not about open borders. You do support not allowing certain people to come, and that there is merit to that idea. There is merit to the idea of not allowing people with very radically anti-American ideas to be in the United States, people who are going to be net fiscal burdens. Because it might be your right to bring your parent, but is it your right to impose a $300,000 net fiscal burden on the rest of society? Well, maybe if you pay for it, but that's a restriction, right?
Or, gee, maybe they could waive the rights to get benefits so they can get their paper stamped and live.
Well, but then that you're saying that that person is not allowed to ever become an American and a full citizen.
Oh, how terrible. Like, that is nothing compared to you.
Well, this is not the UAE. This is not the UAE. This is the United States.
Well, let us learn from a country that has figured out something. And let us also not say because a country is worse overall that they can't do one important thing far better than we do, which they do.
Bryan, to what extent, though, are the arguments that both you and Alex make drawn from kind of cherry-picked, dramatically smaller, very, very different societies? Why should we believe that the UAE's immigration policy is applicable outside of pure sort of global anarcho-capitalist ethics?
Let's see. Well, we can start with so there's two different kinds of wrongfully extending your prediction from the earlier data. So one of them is just saying, well, Israel was able to let its population grow by 10%, so we could go and grow it by 1,000%. All right, that I think is actually a weak argument. On the other hand, UAE literally multiplied its population by a factor of 34 in the course of 50 years. They really did. It can totally be done. It was not only was it not a disaster, it was a miracle. If you go there, you can see what can be accomplished with an open mind and reasonable immigration policies. And the reasonable immigration policy is not, ooh, yuck, you're a janitor, you're going to be a burden on us. The reasonable policy is, we need janitors. We are not going to go and give you $1 million of oil money, but you can come here and get a job and earn 5 times the money that you would back home. So I don't think that this is anything that is that hard to understand. It's not something where we are generalizing far beyond what we experienced. It's saying that we need to go and look at all the data And we have seen it is totally possible to do amazing things. By the way, also worth pointing out, the US multiplied its population 100-fold in its first 200 years. It is not a miracle. It is totally doable. It has been done right here in this country.
Daniel, like 60 seconds.
Well, yes, the UAE is an absolute monarchy, a dictatorship, where none of these people will ever have voting rights. Not even their own citizens have voting rights. So, like, it really doesn't matter what those people think. If you disagree, if you say something against the monarchy, you get deported. So nobody can be a cultural threat, because anybody who attempts to be a cultural threat is expelled from the country, even their own citizens. This is just not the United States, and I don't want to be like the UAE. Now, I do think that the United States should welcome a lot of immigrants, probably more legally than it does now. But look at the example of other actually comparable societies like Australia, where, by the way, support among the native population for immigrants is much higher than in the United States, partially because the immigrants are better selected. Imagine how much less vitriol there would be in the United States today against immigrants if all the immigrant flow spoke English. If all the immigrant flow was sponsored, say, by an employer, and there was less family sponsorship, less people who were elderly, the reality is that you would not be able to attack immigrants very much. And that is a good thing. That would be good for immigrants. That would be good for the United States.
Bryan, I'll turn back to you with this question, and then I want to open it up. So if you have questions, start lining up at this microphone, and we'll try to take 2 or 3 before we wrap things up. One thing to Daniel's point, he's fundamentally, in a way, he's talking about what's practical, what is politically viable. One of the things we have seen in the U.S. recently and in U.S. history is that when the volume of immigration has increased, it has provoked a political backlash. We just experienced that in the past 4 years. It also was experienced in the run-up to the 1924 restrictions. So how do you respond to the fact that we are a democratically regulated government, and large-scale immigration does seem to, in the US at least, provoke a political backlash that can sometimes get pretty ugly?
So I would start off by saying, if we want to understand the political effects of immigration, we want to go and zoom out and look at the totality of the data. It is always possible to see that before immigration gets restricted, there's some scary stories in the media and say it must be because people responding to objective facts. However, one of the general things I work on is the economics of politics, and one of the strongest lessons of the economics of politics is that objective reality and public opinion have almost nothing to do with each other. That is just the truth. It is totally possible that you can have a large increase in immigration while people barely notice. You can have almost no problems with immigration, but there's some scary stories, and this freaks people out, and everything in between. I mean, it really is much along the lines of, well, you can see that people are getting really upset about inequality, and therefore there's going to be a backlash. Like, well, is it even true that people's perceptions of inequality correlate with objective inequality? So I would say that I reject the premise. Rather, the best way to think about it is there will always be endless scary stories about immigrants. Why? Because people have a deep-seated dislike of immigration and immigrants. Human beings, not just Americans, human beings all over the planet are xenophobic. And if you were to say, well, then how realistic is it to think that we can get a lot more immigration? Look, honestly, I will just say, my job is to put out arguments and argue in favor of the policies that I think are best. If someone says, all right, we're not going to be able to get that, then how about we go and consider something more moderate? Then I'll say, all right, what's the most extreme thing we can get? That I'm happy to do.
30 seconds before we turn to questions.
Yeah, there's actually a really good study that shows that you are actually not right about this political question, where they did a random polling and had 2 groups, and they basically showed them profiles of immigrants, and they asked them, based on those characteristics, would you want this person admitted into the United States? And included their education, their name, to kind of tell them a cue of their ethnicity. And they're likely to, be an engineer or something, something like that. If the more educated the immigrant was, the more support they had from all across the political spectrum, especially among conservatives. Yes, there was ethnic discrimination, but it was totally swamped by the educational factor and the profession. And I bet if you added the political question and you said, and this person is likely to vote for, say, X political party, it would also change the perception. So it's not true that people are naturally xenophobic. It's true that people are seeking what's best for their interest. And they casually understand, they instinctively understand that somebody who's more highly educated is more likely to contribute, and somebody who has different values could be a threat.
All right, let's keep the questions short and a question, not a statement.
Sure.
Go for it.
Mr. DiMartino, is your problem really with unskilled immigrant labor, or is it with massive migration at the border? And Professor Caplan, do you deny that massive migration at the border is a problem, or is it a problem that can be resolved with liberalized immigration policy?
Yeah, so my problem is not inherently with it being in the border or not. It's just about the fiscal impact and the values. I think there's some legal immigration who is bad, and there's actually some illegal immigrants who might be good. The proportions might be different, but that's how I would describe it.
Bryan?
Yeah, so if people could legally come without incidents, then there wouldn't be chaos at the border, of course. I would also say that it is easy to make it look like chaos at the border regardless of how many or a few people are here, because that is the point of the media, right? A general point about the media. What is their job? To find the most horrifying things on Earth on a planet with 8 billion people. Every day they succeed, keeping people in a constant state of terror and terror and happiness. Far better to do it check statistics. That's the kind of thing that Daniel's doing, so I definitely support that. Turn off the news, read Daniel's paper, you will learn a lot more.
All right, next up.
Hello there. So my name is Sam, and I'm actually a student at George Mason University, fun fact. But anyway, so my question specifically for Bryan Caplan is, I know DiMartino, I think he brought this up earlier, but it's like the UAE, the way the government is structured is much different from the United States. It's like, even if the population is 90% immigrants, none of these immigrants can vote or change like who's in power. I was wondering, do you think, are we gonna have to change our structure of government to something more like the UAE for open borders to work? Or can it work under our current democratic Republican order? And I guess what we would have to do to, adapt to that.
Yeah, it can totally work under our current system. In order to answer that, you really do have to look at first of all, public opinion. You've got to look at whether immigrants even feel like voting. The punchline is that the foreign-born are not, in the United States, do not have opinions that are that different from that of natives. If you go and look at immigrants and say, oh, they're a bunch of statists, yeah, guess what? Americans are a bunch of statists too. So the right thing to do is to look at the marginal difference. The marginal difference is there, but it's mild, so I don't think, in fact, you need to have any fundamental change of government in order to make it work. I do think that we could rest easier if we were to go and say that immigrants have to wait a lot longer in order to vote. And I think that's a totally reasonable idea.
I want to piggyback on something Bryan just said, that we've got a lot of commies coming out, and you said it too. We got a lot of commies that we're training in our entire school system, taking to the streets to promote all manner of nonsense. So wouldn't it be great? Should we do like a trade, like every blue-haired banshee for a Mexican?
No, you don't need to trade. You don't need to trade. You can just send, But
the serious question is the cultural question from a values perspective really about immigration, or is it not about immigration?
Oh, no, immigration is just one of the factors that affects it, but obviously this is really about the education system, and I tell this to all the conservative groups I speak to, which is like, I think people focus too much on the cultural impact of immigration when really the educational impact is what's really killing us. But even then, why should you allow Maoists, CCP members, supporters of terrorist Islamic organizations still in the United States? It makes no sense. Just because, the threat is small. I'm not saying that you shouldn't let in anybody. I'm just saying, try not to let in those people. Surely somebody will slip in. I'm not saying that this is a riskless world, but try not to let them. Just like you try, you prohibit, say, guns in airplanes or whatever. Like, that doesn't mean somebody won't try to kidnap an airplane, but you try to stop that, right?
This is the wrong crowd for prohibiting guns from anywhere.
I guess
Sorry.
I should have used a different example.
One more question from the group.
Thank you both for speaking with us. My question is primarily for DiMartino. So you mentioned a particular group that the United States did not let in after World War II, the Nazis. Another group they didn't let in during World War II primarily were the Jews. The Jewish people were kept out of a lot of Europe as well as the United States. And looking at Israel and looking at Jews in general, how well they perform economically and how economically viable Israel is now, would you say it's probably a huge mistake they didn't do that?
Oh, it was an absolute terrible mistake.
One follow-up. And then, so with that in mind, as well as the mistakes the government makes in general, how can you trust the state to make good decisions in terms of...
But by the way, it wasn't just a mistake because there would have been a fiscal contributing group.
Right.
It was a mistake because it was a purposefully racist policy to exclude them that also ended up in their mass murder. So even if just to save them from mass murder, that's a different thing, right?
Including refugees from other countries now that are facing violence?
Well, nothing like the Jews were facing, but certainly the North Koreans are facing something similar, you could argue. And I mean, in fact, any North Korean would very easily qualify for refugee status in the US. The problem is getting out, right? That's a different question. So, you know, I mean, Israel saw that experience, and I think Bryan casually mentioned that after the Soviet Union fell, all those people, a lot of people immigrated to Israel. Now, that was a highly successful, highly intelligent group of people. They did very well in Israel, but they did change the culture, but to in a very positive way. What I've read is that the political parties in Israel had to stop using red because all the Soviet Jews hated red because they hated communism. So that was a good outcome, I guess.
Bryan, I have a question. I have a question for both of you, and thank you, everybody. We'll wrap this up. We do seem to have a problem in the United States in that all of the commanding heights of our culture have become fairly anti-American. Not exclusively, but quite a bit. Both of you are in academia. You guys are at the centerpiece of the hatred of the country, by and large. Isn't it an issue that when certainly my grandparents came to this country, the culture of the country on average was America good? Now, the culture in the country in a lot of quarters is America bad. Doesn't immigrating into America bad pose a different kind of problem culturally than past times of immigrating into America good?
Somewhat different, but not that different. I mean, so here's probably the best way of thinking about it. So Alex and Rostos actually worked on this question of patriotism of immigrants. It seems like they're more patriotic than natives. So if anything, we should be letting them in so they can teach us to love our own country again. I would say overall, it's just not much. It's a pretty weak argument.
I think the average immigrant, that's certainly true, but that doesn't mean it's true for all, nor does it validate the notion that you should let in people who are really hateful of the country, right? And so I think that it just makes all the sense for cultural and economic reasons to limit immigration based on those skills and those ideas. And especially if you are of the very cosmopolitan notion like myself, you believe America is an idea, right? You don't believe America is an ethnic nation. Therefore, you should believe that the ideas matter. The Constitution was written for a virtuous people, and it is about people. And you know, no matter what laws you write, the people can change them. So if you're bringing in a lot of people who hate the country, that's a bad thing. If you're miseducating them, I think that's even more important. But I saw that a lot. You know, one of the first things that I had to do when I came to the United States was a walk of privilege, where if you were a man, you step forward. If you were a woman, you step back. If you were black, you step back. That's why they try to teach immigrants in this country, and native-born Americans. So I think that must be changed. Still, why are there Hamas supporters being given visas to come to the United States? And I think President Trump was right to try to restrict that.
Bryan, do you have any last words? I'll give you the last word before we turn back to the audience.
Yep. Daniel's a great guy, great scholar. You should read his work, but read it carefully and also take a careful look at how sensitive the results are to the assumptions. While I think it is a terrible idea to say that a person can't be in this country because they're not going to pay enough taxes, still, a lot of people do believe that argument. And if you think that argument, and since that argument is out there, it's worthwhile going to the numbers and seeing how solid that argument is. I think if you really read Daniel's work, as well as people that are going and opening up the hood and taking a look at what he's found, I don't think he has actually found results that should make anyone worried about low-skilled immigrants.
All right, so let's put that slide back up. This is our post-debate survey. And see how this conversation and this debate may or may not have changed your minds. If you have, let's take a couple minutes, 90 seconds. Cast your vote. Should the United States limit immigration based on merit? Daniel says yes. Bryan says no. Raise your hand when you've completed it. Looking pretty good. Who's struggling but still trying to do it? Any stragglers, or are we all done?
I saw a couple. There's a couple.
Okay.
By the way, does anyone know if Ross Ulbricht is actually here? Anyone seen him?
Oh.
He's not on the roster. I was just curious.
All right. Okay, let's see. We're going to put up the results now. So the first, this is the pre-result. Before the debate, where were we at? Let's see if this will work, if the technology will fail us. No. Is this, okay. Pre, okay. 42, 43, 40, okay. No. The no's have it. Now let's see post. Okay, let's see how this works.
Post.
As
You're not checking again.
it appears to have changed almost not at all.
Okay, it's changing. It's changing. Why is it still moving?
It's the miracles of technology.
Hold on, get your votes in, people. It's not too
Some
late.
people are doing some voter fraud here.
As one would expect at a libertarian conference, changing any of these people's minds is impossible. I want to thank my good friend Bryan Caplan, Daniel DiMartino. Thank you for the debate. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bryan. Of course, sir.